This is Thank You Mama, weekly lessons from mothers all around the world. Hi and welcome to Thank You Mama. My name is Anna Teider. My guest today is Mitra Jordan. Hi Mitra and welcome.
Hello.
Hi. So Mitra is a retired preschool teacher and a mom of two and a hobby potter. And Mitra, normally I introduce my guests with, and she originally comes from, but with you it's a little bit tricky. Because your mom is Iranian, your dad is Indian, you were born in the United States, you grew up in the UK, and now you live in the United States. So do you have an answer to that question? Where do you come from originally?
Well, my grandmother always said I was English. I had English roots because that was, I suppose, the most impressive time of my life when children learn, between grades 2 and 12. But now I feel American.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah. And my children are American. My husband is American, but it's true. Yeah.
Mitra, I think we should just jump into your mom's story because through your mom's story, we'll tell the story of Iran and also your story. It is also beautifully intertwined. Okay. Will you tell me about your mom? And we have to introduce her. Her name is Sattareh Farman Farmaian.
And she was born in 1920, so she grew up before the Shah arrived in Iran, the last Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. She was part of the last dynasty. Her family was from the Qajar dynasty, and when she was born, Reza Shah had just been appointed Shah, or was just about to be Shah. So she grew up at a time that her family was quite repressed because they were from the previous dynasty. But, of course, she grew up, they were a wealthy royal family and had lots of lands. And her father was a very influential man in her life. He had, over the course of his life, 8 wives, 36 children, some of whom died in infancy, but he had 12 daughters and 20 sons who all survived and lived to be adults. My mother was born to wife number 3, and she had 8 siblings. She was number 3, number 15 of all of her father's children. She was born at a time when the girls were supposed to be talented in sewing, cooking, and being beautiful and getting ready, preparing for marriage to a boy. My mother was born younger than all her older sisters at the time, and she was with a bunch of her brothers, and she did not grow up like that. She grew up climbing trees and hiking and swimming, and her mother finally realized this was not the girl that she had expected, but this was a boy, and she used to count her as one of her boys.
I just love her descriptions of, I don't know how to call it, a palace or a compound in which she grew up. She calls it a harem, and they're all the women and their children and servants and beautiful gardens and fountains, and the children were playing outside together. The picture stayed so vivid in my head.
The harem is a place where the women are, the wives and the children. It has nothing to do with Hollywood sex.
Yes.
Scenes. So, 4 of my grandmothers lived inside the compound, and the first one, who was a princess, had a house just outside. The women who lived inside were best friends. They were not jealous of the fact that their husband married somebody else. They grew up as friends. And then my grandfather, who we call Shazde, He had his own house in the compound. So they didn't always see him. He was sometimes at his own house. And my grandmothers had their nights when they would go to his house and be with him. My grandmother went on Wednesdays. That was her night to spend with him. But when he brought home wife number 4, she came from Kermanshah. My grandmother thought it was a present for her because he brought home this beautiful 16-year-old, and my grandmother thought it was her playmate, her best friend, and the women did things together. They went shopping, they bought materials, they sewed for the whole compound, which was about 1,000 people. They made jams, they made pickles. That was how they lived. And it's amazing to me how my grandmother worked so hard to do all these things. They were constantly working, sewing, fixing things, and especially arranging the fruits and the nuts for their storage.
It's like you said, the Hollywood idea or Hollywood image of a harem is completely different. It's of women lounging around and being bathed and pampered. And as I read in this book, these women really worked. Yeah. They worked hard. She was pregnant with 9 children, and the whole time she really, really worked from dusk till dawn, basically.
This was one of the upper class royal families.
Yeah.
So, it's not like they had it easy either.
Yeah. But let's go back to Mama Sati. So she went to school, which was not usual for girls of her.
Well, my grandfather made sure all his children went to school. At that time, there were a lot of missionaries in Iran, and my mother went to a missionary school that was established from the Baha'is. They were American. And my mother loved school, loved the women there. And Dr. Jordan, no relation to me, but he established the boys' school where many of my uncles went. So my mother was educated, and it was one of her women teachers who talked her into applying to college in the U.S. She noticed she was very academic and loved to study and learn things. One of my uncles has told me that the only reason he finished high school was because my mother did all the work for him. She was... And then he went on to University of Wisconsin and got a PhD.
Oh, that's amazing.
So, some people are just slow at the beginning and then they speed up.
Yes.
So my mother was very anxious to come to the States and study. And the only reason this really happened for her was that my grandfather died before he could marry her off. I think there were a couple of families that came and they called it khastagari, and they would come, the girl in question would serve tea and they would look her over and decide whether or not she was a good match for their son. It would be the mother, the father, the grandmother, maybe an aunt or two. So after a couple of these, one of them, my mother didn't show up to serve the tea, and the other one, nothing happened, so they probably didn't see what they wanted. And then my grandfather died, and my mother was able to leave without having been married off. All her life, she had this hope chest for her dowry. My grandmother had amassed for all the girls things that they would need in their married life. So my mother sold her 12 place settings to her sister Jabby, who was always entertaining and would probably use them. And she sold all the linens and things that she had in her hope chest. And my grandmother bought the sewing machine from her. So she collected enough money to leave for the United States. And from Tehran, instead of going through Europe and arriving in America, she went east.
But Mitra, this is one of the biggest lessons I learned from this book. And she repeats it twice. She says twice, sometimes in life, if you want to go west, you'll have to go east. And this was so courageous. And it's so true for life that sometimes you have to dare to do something that seems completely crazy and contrary in that moment. And it will take you to your goal. I think that was a beautiful, beautiful message in her book. So she went east.
She went east because at that time World War II was in Europe.
Yes, yeah.
And so she couldn't go through Europe. So she went east. She went through India, encountered people who were protesting, Gandhi's people. But she managed. I don't know how she did it. I thought about it when my kids were little, how they would gone, and she was a woman alone.
Yes.
And how come she wasn't raped or robbed?
Yes.
Or married off?
And this journey lasted for 2 months.
Yeah. And the first boat she got on was torpedoed.
Yeah.
It left the port. It was torpedoed. Came back. They all survived. And then she had to wait another couple of weeks for the American troop ship. And it was carrying back a lot of American troops. And so that's why she ended up in Los Angeles and not New York, because it came through the east. In fact, one of her good friends, who was a professor at UCLA that I knew very well, came, I think, 2 years later, and there were 6 boys in his group. They were young men, and they made the same journey. And he told me that there were times when they were so scared and they didn't know what to do, and they kept telling themselves that, well, Sati did this all by herself. How come the 6 of us are so scared?
So she lands in Los Angeles, and instead of going further to the school she was meant to go to, she enrolls at USC.
Yes, because Dr. Jordan, the one who had been in Iran for around 50 years and was kicked out of Iran and told to go home, he settled in Pasadena. And when my mother arrived at the port in Los Angeles, San Pedro, one of the workers, I think it's called Travelers Aid Society workers, went through her address book and saw that she had an address in Pasadena. And she said, well, this is not so far from Los Angeles. Let me call this person, because my mother arrived. She didn't know the language. She didn't know anybody. She thought she was arriving in New York, for one thing. Not that would have made any difference, but she just needed to get to Ohio. So Dr. Jordan came and picked her up, took her home, and the next Monday he said, you don't need to go to Ohio. We have universities right here in Los Angeles. And he took her to USC. She enrolled that very summer. She was very focused. She was a very good student and ended up graduating with her BS degree in 3 years.
She studied sociology, and then did she immediately finish her master's, or did she?
No, she went to Chicago for her master's.
Yeah. And
then she came back to Los Angeles and she worked. She worked as a social worker.
And when do you come in the game?
After she got her master's, when she came back to work. She had met my father at USC, and they decided to get married. And then I was born. They went to the courthouse to get married, and the judge refused to marry them because he thought my father was black, and interracial marriage was illegal in the U.S. at that time. So they had to go home, and he had to get his passport and show that he wasn't black, he was Indian. And Indians are Caucasians. And so the next day they got married.
Mitra, at one point your father couldn't find work in the film industry that he wanted to, and he went back to India, and later on they got divorced. Do you mind me asking you, have you ever met him? Because in the book we just know that you haven't, but I don't know what happened later.
I haven't.
No, you haven't. Okay. And then your mom at one point, she decided to go back to Iran and to use what she learned both at school and at work to help people in Iran.
Well, she first, before going to Iran, she was hired by the UN to go to Iraq. And she spent 3 years on a project to settle the Kurds, the Kurdish people who are still not settled. The UN program thought that the Kurds would have a better quality of life if instead of being nomadic, they settled and they could have farms and school and medical help for their children and so on. So my mother did that, and so I went, my first year of school, I actually went to first grade in Baghdad and to the American school. But my mother was gone all the time doing field work. So my uncle eventually told her that she needed to send me to boarding school. So then I went to boarding school. So she was in Iraq for 3 years. But after that, then there was a revolution in Iraq. The king was assassinated, and my mother returned to Tehran to start her own school. The UN was a very big help to her initially, supplying her with faculty for the school and materials.
So she opened the school for social work, and it's interesting in the book that how she describes that there wasn't even a term for social work in Farsi, in Persian language, and that she had to come up with a term. So we really can say, as I read somewhere, that she's the mother of social work in Iran, because she started this school, and the school grew bigger and bigger into a university, and then it really spread into supplying the country with social workers and with help for orphanages, with family planning. Yes.
Teaching, opening family centers where women could learn skills. They could make things that could be sold for money that they could receive. And it had daycare for children, so they could, while they were learning, going to classes and learning how to do things and using their skills, their children could be in preschool and daycare.
What's amazing is that she did this hard work, which would be hard enough, especially considering, how difficult the situation of women was in the country with lack of equality and everything. So even with just that, it was difficult enough. But then she had to balance basically, or somehow manage through all the political upheaval that was going on through the country. It was very, very hard for her reading.
Yeah, school was a very big success. The first year, she rented a house downtown Tehran, and several of my grandmothers got to work sewing curtains and making it nice. And I think she was there for 3 years. And all the time she was collecting money to build her own school. So she donated the property and built the Tehran School of Social Work. The school was set up under the Ministry of Education. So she would get her paycheck from the Ministry of Education. And every year she had to go for a meeting with them. And they would tell her, well, you did so much good work and you have it all set up, everything's going well. Why don't you sit back now and we'll take over? Every year there was some man who wanted to be the director of the school. And she had to really fight to hang on to it, even though it was her school. There was always somebody who wanted to take it over because she was a woman and they didn't think she could handle it.
It's interesting to read that she got a lot of support from the Iranian queen, Farah Pahlavi.
Yeah.
And then the revolution happened in 1979.
Yes.
When Ayatollah returned, the people decided they are done with the Shah and his regime. And she got arrested.
That was, I think, in her whole life, that was one of the things that hurt her the most.
Her students turned against her.
Yeah, her own students. And my grandmother had always said to me, don't ever think you're an only child, because your mother's first child is her school, and then two of my cousins follow. So I'm fourth in line. This was heartbreaking for her, that the one place she had worked so hard.
She gave everything up for the school. She sent you off to a boarding school in England. She never remarried, never had other children. The school really was her life.
Yeah. And one reason she didn't remarry, she used to say, is because if she married somebody, it would be said that, oh, she got this because of her husband.
Yeah.
Or because he bribed somebody to give his wife this. That's how the society was. And she didn't want to be indebted to anybody.
So she got arrested and went through a very, very scary process where she had no idea what was going to happen. She was scared she was going to be executed, actually. And shortly after that, she decided to leave the country and come to the United States.
Well, on the advice of the mullah, Taleghani, who came to talk to her.
Yes.
He was the one who let her go, for one thing. He was the one who had been in the Shah's prison, and he recognized her name because one of her programs was prison reform. And he had seen her students coming and going to the prison. So he recognized her, and then he told her about the person who could give her a passport so she could leave. And he said, don't wait. You need to do that. And he and Khomeini later parted ways, and he was poisoned. And the person who gave her the passport was the ambassador to Sweden at one time, and he was killed also. So the two people who helped her escape, that's good that she got out in time.
And now for the second time, she's leaving her country. And there's a beautiful passage in the book where she comes to the airport in Teheran. And of course, it's the beginning of the revolution. Many people are fleeing the country. The airport is super crowded. There are no flights. And one more time, she flies east to go west.
Yes.
So I read, for the rest of her life, she lived in Los Angeles?
She flew to Sri Lanka from Teheran that day.
Yes.
She had a conference to go to, an IPPF, International Planned Parenthood Conference, that she had told them she was attending. So she had to make it seem like she had a suitcase for 5 days, not the rest of it. And anyway, she didn't have time to go home and get organized. She never went home again after that first morning that she was arrested. She flew from Sri Lanka directly to London and then looked around, met some people there. IPPF headquarters is there, but was not able to get a job at that time. So she came to see us, and then in Los Angeles, she took the county exam and got 100%. And so they hired her as a social worker. And every year they wanted to promote her to be boss, and she said, no, I've been boss, I want to be the social worker. So she stayed long enough to get a pension. So one of her things was to always be able to stand on your own feet.
Yes. Mitra, I love it. We're starting the lessons now. You just shared the first lesson with us.
Of all her sisters, she's the only one who was able to do that. Because her father put all the educational emphasis on the boys. The boys became doctors. There were 12 PhDs in the family.
Oh, wow.
But the women became wives. And so when the revolution happened, women were not able to go out and have a job like my mother did.
Mitra, before we really dive into the lessons, I'd just like to conclude her story. I read she passed away at the age of 90. She got to become 90. So she lived in the same country with you and your children.
She became very close to my kids. She really did things to keep in touch with them at their level as they were growing up. So in that respect, she became much closer to them than she would have if she stayed in Iran.
Yes, yes. Mitra, let's jump into her lessons. I'm very curious to hear what you feel you learned from her. What were the most important things you learned from her?
Well, I'm very, very happy with my education, and that was something that she always stressed. And the fact that I went to a very nice boarding school that two of my uncles had gone to. And as I was telling my Christmas group, we were talking about Christmas. My first Christmas there, she, I think, had forgotten about Christmas. She didn't really know about the British calendar. So Christmas is a month long, Easter is a month long. But she had told me when I left Teheran that she would see me in the summer. We just didn't travel much in those days. It was too expensive. And so at Christmas time, my house mother said to me, you know, it was approaching Christmas. She said, "So where are you going? Is your mother coming to see you and pick you up?" And I said, "No, I'll see her in the summer." And then my house mother started to get worried about, you know, what was going to happen to me because the school closed for the month. So she called a day family in the area and asked them if they would, you know, be able to take care of another child. They already had 4 children. They said, "Yeah, sure." And so I went and stayed with them. I loved Christmas. It was a farm. We had so much fun that for the next 10 years, I spent Christmas with them and Easter and everything else.
They became your Christmas family.
My English family.
Are you still in touch with them?
Yes.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yes.
They were all so nice to me, and the parents were wonderful. And it was a dairy farm. I don't think I'd ever been around cows before. It was very nice.
Mitra, let's go back to lessons. So we have the importance of education. You also already mentioned being independent and self-reliant. Is there anything else you feel you've learned from her?
Well, little things. At a time when nobody hiked, especially not women, she went to the mountains every weekend and hiked. She recruited students from the school to hike with her. I would complain because I didn't really feel like hiking, but seeing I was only in Tehran for 2 months of the year, she didn't want to leave me at home, and she wanted me to come with her for the day to hike a mountain or something. And I would complain. It was hard. It was hot. It was dusty. And then she would say to me, "Well, if I don't do this, I will have to go spend my money seeing a therapist."
I love that.
The hiking was for her mind.
Yes.
And that was the way she relaxed. And now it's very easy for us to say, "Yeah, go for a walk, go do exercise." We know all about the endorphins but in the 1950s, people did not talk about exercise in that way. So she was way ahead of her time in that she knew what she needed. Another thing I learned from her, she always spoke to me in Farsi. From the time I was little, she spoke to me in Farsi, which was, I didn't like it so much when I was very young. Because I think, you know, I didn't know why, you know, everybody else spoke this other language. She spoke this. But I appreciated it more when I was in England because we were closer in speaking Farsi than we would have been speaking English. And she also tried to get me to learn the written language. So when I would come home in the summers, she had a teacher. I was too stupid to understand that this was really a good thing. I hated it. The teacher was extremely boring. she got somebody else. It was very boring. And I finally said I didn't want to learn it. And now I'm sorry. She was right. Because some of the Farsi written language is very difficult. The poetry, it's not the language to speak. It's a different kind of language. Their methods were very antiquated. The method in Persian school was read it, memorize it, write it 3 times, copy it, and then they give you a dictation. And then you've learned that lesson. You turn the page and go to the next one. And I just found that so different from what I had in England at my English school. There was no thinking involved. You didn't sit down and write a paper with your own views. So I couldn't stand it. And she told me that's how Persian education was. And actually, when she started her school, she would notice that a lot of the university students would just parrot back things to her. And she would say, I want you to think, and I want you to say something that may not have been said before. And if it's wrong, no one's going to laugh or hit you or anything. And that was very different. That kind of education was very different.
Mitra, I would like to ask you about 2 things. What really struck me is this big ambition and this goal, how goal-oriented she was and how focused she was on her work. Is there a lesson to draw out of there? Is there anything you think would be a lesson out of that? For my part, I have to tell you, when I was reading this, I felt, I'm sorry to be a little critical, but I felt this lack of balancing a private life and professional life. You know, I felt better about my lack of ambition.
Yeah, me too. But there's a Margaret Mead saying, and Margaret Mead was one of her favorite people, something about it only takes one person to have an idea. My mother fits that exactly. Sometimes, when the school was going along and everything was going well, I thought, well, that's great. And then the next year I'd come home for the summer holidays, and she would have started something else for teaching women in the community centers to knit. And then the next year there was family planning. And then the next year, she was always expanding. And I thought, what's wrong with just having a school? It was always something else. Right before the revolution, when she retired, she had just got permission. She pursued getting doctors to come to the welfare centers and give vasectomies. First, she had to educate the men that their sex lives, would not be over with a vasectomy. It's just that they wouldn't have to feed another mouse. And after that, she had been working on going through the Muslim, some kind of hierarchy in Cairo that went through the Quran and decided that abortions would also be okay. And, if it's okay religiously, then she would be able to do it. And that had just happened, and she was excited about that. So she was always working on making things better for the people. And sometimes, if we wanted to go somewhere, we would come out of the house, and at the gate, there would be 3 people standing in line waiting to see her. As a younger child, I would get really annoyed and start to whine, and then she would turn to me and she would say, he has 4 children at home and they don't have dinner tonight. And then I would feel really bad. But she was always looking out for the people who needed her. She was I call it a social work gene, and other social workers I've met have that. It takes something to be a social worker. Not everybody is cut out to be it. And I know I'm not.
Growing up without her close to you, did you have a different relationship with your children? Did you keep them very close to you?
I did.
Yeah.
I did.
Okay.
When they were, each one, when they were 7, I thought, wow, this would be the age when I would have gone to school. And I thought, I would never do that. I look at what I'm going to miss. Mm-hmm. I'm going to miss all the cute things, all his funny jokes, all the little quirks of, having a child in the house. I enjoyed them too much. And I know she came to realize that she had given up a lot, because when she came to this country, my children were 1 and 3, I think. Mm-hmm. She really enjoyed them. She loved children. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. She came and stayed with us a lot. She would spend a lot of time with them, and I think a lot of it was because she had missed out on my childhood.
Yes, yes.
Even when I came home for the summers, I was there for 2 months. Mm-hmm. She would take her 2-week vacation while I was there, and we would go camping. The whole family would go camping. But then after that, there was another 6 weeks, and sometimes she would take another week somewhere. We would go on a long hike. But there were at least 4 or 5 weeks where she still had to work. I either came to her office with her and did things, or I would go to visit my cousins. I spent a lot of time with other family, even though we only saw each other for 2 months of a year. But I think she made up with my children, because at that time, she didn't have a really stimulating job that she had to work.
Yeah.
You talk about how women are managing today with home and work. Mm-hmm. She didn't manage that well when I was a child. If something came up for work, she was there. She stayed late. She went early. She was always at work by 7. And we had lunch plans. She was late, But when my children were little, she always came home. When we went to visit her, we would be there for several weeks in the summer. Mm-hmm. She came home at 5 o'clock. She was home. Sometimes she would go work early and then leave at lunchtime. She made a plan to be with us every day. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really hard for working people.
Yes.
Even my husband says he had a job where he had to go in early and stay late. He was hardly ever home for dinner. And he says he missed out on a lot of things. He never came to band concerts, things that happen with the kids. That's the hardest thing. And the working world and the kids' world don't have the same hours.
Mitra, thank you so much. This was incredible. Her story is really incredible, and I feel like we learned some interesting things. Let me try to recap. Yeah. So we learned about the importance of education. We learned about the importance of being independent and self-reliant. I love it how she taught you to hike and love nature. And I'm quoting, if you don't hike, you'll need to spend your money on a therapist. That's a good one. I also wrote down as a lesson the importance of the mother tongue. And I wrote down, I don't know if it's a lesson, but I did write down that you learned through not being so close to her to keep your kids close to you and appreciate them.
Yeah, yes.
Let me say thank you so much for being my guest, and thank you for sharing your mom with me and my listeners, and thank you for the awesome lessons.
Oh, you're welcome. I enjoy sharing my mother, and I miss her a lot.
I know.
Every day I think something.
I know.
But yes.
We miss them when they're gone.
So you're welcome. I know. So enjoy them. My lesson, enjoy them while you have them.
That's another lesson. Yes, enjoy your mom while you have her next to you. Thank you, Mitra. If you enjoy Thank You Mama and want to help it grow, please take the 2 seconds to leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps. If you'd like to get in touch, you can send me a mail at info@thankyouMama.net. You can also find me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter under Anna Teider, that's Tajder. This was Thank You Mama. Come back next week, subscribe, and tell your friends.